Welcome back to the Lift Free and Diet Hard podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Coates. Join me along with industry leaders and friends on a quest to get more people through the gym door and eating and living healthier. Join me where evidence meets empathy while rejecting fitness industry fads and extremism. Let's begin. Taylor Ryan. I've been looking forward to this one for a while. You and I have chatted over, social media for a really long time. You're quite far away in Australia. You're a sports dietitian, and you are, I think your tagline goes, fuel like an elite athlete. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on board. It's been great.
Awesome. As always, I'll dive right in. So question, how do people balance fueling for performance in an active lifestyle with the goal of getting or staying lean?
Yeah, this is a hard one, and it's getting people to understand that they're two conflicting, goals really. One is involving to be in a calorie deficit, and then one is involving obviously extra calories or at least at maintenance to perform. So it's getting people to understand, and you probably see this as well, their definition of the sport they're choosing to do. Most people don't understand how their sport themselves works, how much output it needs, how much calories and requirements. So I always say to people, look, we can do this for a period of time, but at some point you're going to have to choose. Okay. Is it more performance that you're focusing on? Because at the end of the day, our athletes who perform aren't necessarily the healthiest, right? Or they're not going to, their goal for potentially aesthetics isn't always going to be the case. Just like if you flip the coin and say, if your goal is solely to be the leanest individual, you're not necessarily going to perform the best, nor are you going to be the most healthiest. They all come with their extreme consequences, and how much that person wants to push those extremities will guide us towards, I guess, the direction that we go with their goal, if that makes sense. It is very hard for people to understand the difference, which I think particularly just active individuals compared to even elite athletes, they don't really understand that. And you get them to see that they're sporting, you can really see the gap in if they actually understand the output of their sport. We see a lot with CrossFitters, right? They say that they want to be able to perform at the best, but they're scared of carbohydrates. I'm like, okay, well, that shows a knowledge deficit for me, that people don't really understand the importance of fueling from a carbohydrate perspective for a high intensity based sport. Obviously that varies, like, recreational athletes, everyday gym goers, that fueling to perform and staying lean, can be achieved because the severity of their goal is quite low, if that makes sense. So as their goal becomes more serious for both ends, that's when you have to really juggle and get the individual to understand what they're trying to achieve and the consequences, pros and cons of both, I guess.
There's a bunch of different directions I want to take this, but let's go here first. What do you do when a pseudoscientific nutritional ideology gets loose within a training community? And I think CrossFit is notoriously associated with paleo dieting, which has probably got some solid concepts in it and some pseudoscientific ones.
Yeah, it is really hard because it's getting people to understand, personal biasness versus actual evidence base, and also who are pushing those agendas themselves. 9 times out of 10, as we know, the pseudoscience individuals have no real justification as to why they're pushing things, and they're just doing it because it suits their narrative. So getting people to understand, like the paleo diet, zone diet, carnivore diet, keto diet, those are the ones that get pushed within the CrossFit realm a lot. But they all come back to one, general concept is that there's no real evidence behind it whatsoever for performing athletes, nor is it going to be beneficial long-term nor sustainable. So I usually say to people, if it's a fad diet, you need to ask yourself, can you see yourself doing this in 3 to 4 years' time? And at the end of the day, CrossFit, regardless of whether you're just walking into it or you are an elite athlete, you'll need carbohydrates. The amount that you need for that is going to differ. And obviously, yes, we all want to promote wholesome foods, that type of thing. There's a few things like the paleo diet does have some, pros towards it. But the moment it says you have to eliminate things or do anything like that, that's a red flag. And I feel like a lot of the general pop don't really apply critical thinking because, in a scenario, why would they? It's not necessarily their field. They're just getting told what is being pushed by, certain people, certain agendas, certain organizations. And as we know, they're not evidence-based because they don't necessarily need to be, because 9 times out of 10, they're run by private organizations.
Are the elite end of the athlete spectrum, are they generally better because they're so concerned with performance? Do they often gravitate towards more evidence-based resources? Or,
Um,
and is it the recreational ones that are maybe a little bit more vulnerable to the ideology?
I would say a bit of both, to be fair. Like, I've worked with elite athletes, and some of them have this connotation, with less the fear of carbohydrates, even though they're at elite level and they know that they need a certain amount of carbohydrates, but it's their understanding of the so-called weight gain that comes with it. But then you also do see it with recreational athletes because, you know, they're just getting into the sport. They love it. You know, it's what the, I guess, environment or people who are pushing it being like, oh no, you need to do this diet over that diet. And not understanding the definition of evidence-based. I don't think many people really get that. I know that sounds silly, but within these type of communities, it is very prominent. They're just like, well, that person's doing this and they've gone this lean, and not, you know, understanding the fact that this person's an elite athlete. They've been doing it for like 15 plus years to get the physique that they're at. So I guess it's a really long-winded answer, but yes and no, because some of my elite athletes, when I've worked with them, I've been shocked. I'm like, I don't know how, and they're functioning to a degree, but I'm like, imagine what you could be if you were actually utilizing the proper evidence-based protocols to get where you need to be, if that makes sense.
What are the risks? Like, what are the downside risks of these, you know, suboptimal fueling strategies, especially if they're sort of bounded in a rigid ideology?
Yeah, and I think getting people to understand initially, because people are like, well, what's the difference between a calorie deficit if I'm trying to lose body composition or body fat, and then the severities of underfueling? Do you know what I mean? A lot of people don't understand the difference between that. And everything starts off as a calorie deficit, right? So for those who understand the differences, it's a deliberate strategy that we have as a calorie deficit to lose, you know, consume fewer calories than you burn, specifically targeted at a certain amount of fat loss over a period of time, right? And as we know, our body will naturally downregulate with that because we're becoming smaller and vice versa. But the issue is when we have low energy availability, what we see there is that that's the energy availability that's left over, you know, after we exercise, and it's insufficient to support our essential bodily functions. So what we see, this is where serious health concerns can come in, and a lot of people don't know the difference. And the severities of LEA, low energy availability, start off with, like, you know, you start in a calorie deficit, then all of a sudden you don't have enough energy for your period, so your body downregulates that. Then all of a sudden you don't have enough energy for your gut or your endocrine system. And basically, I like to think of it to people and explain it as your low battery saving mode on your iPhone. So, you know, when you have a lot of energy and your phone's doing fine, it's green, and then it goes to yellow when it's starting to, you know, die of its energy, and then it goes into power saving mode, and any of the apps that aren't needed in the background are essentially downregulated. And that's exactly what we explain to people when they're going through LEA. Like, you started off with calorie deficit, now your training has gone to shit, your performance is suffering, your recovery is bad, and now your body's now starting to shut down with its bodily functions, which is, you know, very severe. And long-term ramifications of this can be quite intense for athletes. It can be death, like cardiac, you know, death from that perspective, because of the high concerns that we see with this underfueling. But this is happening not just at elite level, it's happening at recreational, because who are you and I to differ that if we're in a recreational athlete and we just love training and we push to the extent that we want to, and not realizing the ramifications of underfueling and not understanding how much your body needs for the output that you're doing.
At what point does this cross over into disordered eating, or let's say an eating disorder, or you know, something in that category?
So low energy availability, to give you a bit of a background, is the cause of RED, so relative energy deficiency in sport. Now, that's a syndrome, an umbrella, right? And that is signs and symptoms that can affect a lot of things. So, for example, underfueling, disordered eating patterns, A-type personality. So it all usually starts off with, I just want to become fitter, I want to become faster, I want to become leaner. All of a sudden, people are like, you know, oh, I need to overtrain because I overate. It's all those little tendencies, or I fear carbohydrates, more so associated with orthorexia, which is, you know, a disordered eating pattern, which is quite heavily involved within the fitness industry, because it's all about, I need to look a certain way, all these type of tendencies that lead to the risk of eating disorders, because obviously eating disorders is mental health conditions and actual heavily concern, is usually driven by disordered eating tendencies themselves. So 9 times out of 10, if someone's going through LEA or stepping into that realm, they're going to have some sort of disordered eating tendencies, because that's half the reason why they got there in the first place, is this control, this obsession, you know, with training and eating and fueling, and not really knowing the difference between that when that becomes severe.
Do you have any thoughts on, to what degree is this people with disordered eating tendencies and where it's really a mental health thing, and they've found their way into some sort of sport, which is sort of a socially acceptable way to like train really hard, which manifests as orthorexia? And to what degree can some sports, you know, fitness industry stuff in general, potentially, I don't love the word cause, but let's, for lack of a better one, potentially cause someone to drift into that territory?
Yeah, and it's very common with the evidence that we see this in weight making sports or aesthetic sports. So, for example, fighting, MMA, weightlifting, anything, powerlifting. Then you got gymnastics is very heavily involved with that sort of stuff. So, it's anything where I guess weight driven or aesthetics is an outcome, unfortunately. So they're very high risk because the pressure of the sport themselves, in terms of what they have to do to be able to make weight initially, can fuel some of the disordered eating tendencies as well. And then what we see with, I guess, CrossFit is because it's a combination of, strength conditioning and all those aspects as well. They tend to have drawn athletes from those sports into that community anyway, if that makes sense. So I think it's more so, the previous exposure of the individual, where their understanding is with nutrition and their exercise regime. Is it healthy? Is it not considered healthy? I think this is where the importance of allied health professionals step in, whether it's dietitians, sports dietitians, exercise physiologists, psychologists. It's the reason why it's important to seek someone who's qualified within these areas to help you with nutrition or exercise, because we can, start to see those red flags. And it is quite common, because all I can start with is, like, I might say to you, hey, Andrew, I've really been doing this program. It looks great. And all you turn around and say is, oh, well done, Taylor. You're looking really good. And unfortunately, this is why we try not to comment on people's body compositions, because you don't know what's going on in the background for that individual. And you could just be fueling my obsession, being like, well, this person only recognizes my success, but I've got all these things going on in the background that are fueling my obsession to stay and look the way I do. So it's things like that. So it's, I guess, heavily involved from, that external and internal factors of that, if it makes sense.
Absolutely. This stuff's, I think, really helpful. I remember I was traveling at a conference. It was probably the first conference I ever traveled to, 2017, and I saw Dr. Sue Kleiner speak on this particular issue. And Sue's a legend in this space. She had talked about a presentation. I think she'd coached Serena Williams, amongst other athletes. And she talked about the pressure that women, on average, more so than men, face, where there's a dual pressure for performance and aesthetics relative to the same pressure men face. And I'll sort of give you guys context. I don't think we see this anymore, but certainly a decade plus ago, it wasn't uncommon for the commentators to make comments on women's appearances in a way you would never hear them talk about men. So are women more vulnerable to this pressure to do both at the same time? And do you have any suggestions, advice, guardrails to help a woman recognize or navigate this?
I think I just want to say that body dysmorphia is present both in male and female, like you did address. So it's not underfueling, and that type of thing doesn't discriminate, essentially. So anyone can be susceptible to it. I feel like it's more pressure, somewhat degree, within females, just because of the society pressure that people place on them, but then also their own internal pressure, because as athletes, they kind of have to, they don't need to look a certain way, but this is I guess, the stigma that they've created that they need to. I think the biggest thing with females, and particularly when they come into, CrossFit or even strength conditioning, is the change that they see, particularly within their body. So they see, I'm putting on weight as per se, which means that means I'm putting on muscle, but I'm not liking it, because previously I've never done anything that involved lifting weights. So it's that transition that we do see, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but getting them to understand we're not looking at you from that perspective. It's what your body can do, and that's impressive. We're looking about becoming fitter, faster, stronger, not just becoming the better version of you now, but for longevity and health and well-being. So when people have these body dysmorphia moments, which is very common, when people say body positivity, don't get me wrong, I'm all for that, but you need to also acknowledge that you're going to have days when you don't feel amazing about your body, and that is also okay. But when we have those scenarios and those days, I always say to my clients, as well as females, what can your body do? What are you proud of? Like, what is it? It can get you from A to B. You can lift certain weights. You can do double your body weight, whatever that is. That's what needs to be your why. Shifting your body composition should not be your why to a point where it creates disordered eating patterns or an unhealthy mindset. So I think it's getting people to understand the difference between that, because, the health and well-being of being able to have your body change in terms of increasing muscle mass and that type of thing, as we know, significantly improves your longevity of your life. So getting other people to understand that difference, and talking that in layman's terms, is very important for the general population, because they're not going to care at the end of the day if you can't relate to them in a way that they're going to be able to understand why their body's changing, if that makes sense.
Sure, absolutely. Is there a good way to approach the timing or strategies for an athlete or recreational or elite athlete who, I think who wants to change their body composition, who wants to drop body fat. And let's say they want to do it in a way that within certain contexts, having a little bit less body fat may actually improve performance as long as they don't go past a certain point, right? Strength to body ratio, muscle to body ratio. Is there a way that you would recommend or guide your athlete, like a particular time during an off season where they can actually, or a particular strategy on how you can go about, let's focus on getting you leaner for this time frame, but then get you back to being more fueled for in-season performance, et cetera?
I think it's a good point. Good question to ask. I think it's getting people to understand from the word go, as soon as you have that consultation or exposure to the individual, that education starts there and then. Because a lot of people don't understand what fueling to perform means. They don't understand. To them, they think, well, I just need to be leaner. That's the answer. And we know that, like you said, body composition may help with performance, but it's not a sole indicator of performance. And this is a big thing that we need to express to them, because just because you're leaner doesn't mean you're going to be the strongest on the field. You know what I mean? Like, or having a six pack, no one cares, because if you can't outrun, outperform, it's irrelevant. So getting them to understand what performance means, and it's not necessarily linked to body composition by any means. And if you can start that, I guess, education from where to go and get them to understand this is what we're going to expect in the calorie deficit. It's more ideal doing this now because it's not in season. Off season is where we want to start to fuel, and getting them to understand why we're doing things, because a lot of people just get told to do something without the why. And it's no wonder why we have a lot of confusion within the fitness industry, because they just get told to do something and not really understand the ramifications of how that person's going to interpret that. A lot of people just go into calorie deficit and just like, I just got told I need to go into calorie deficit because I need to lose a certain amount of body fat. And I'm like, okay, but what's the outcome of that? Why is that happening? Why do you feel that's the case? Because we see it most of the time coming into particularly elite athletes, like even CrossFit Games. A lot of them are coming in trying to be as fuel, or not say as fuel as they can, to be as lean as they can, particularly. And I'm like, but you're about to perform at the most peak part of your career, and you're worrying about your body composition. It's just getting that I guess that differentiation between people to understand that. So, and I always say to people, education is key. So if you can start drip feeding that for the individual, and their level of knowledge is very important.
That totally makes sense. So
Yeah.
try to think about how to frame this, because I like the reframe about getting people to challenge even why they believe that they need to. I'm trying to think of an example. I'm going to go in an interesting place here. So I'm in Canada. Traditionally, I've grown up a baseball fan and a Toronto Blue Jays fan. Now, there will be some people that might chafe at connecting this, what I'm about to say, but in the last couple of seasons ago, there were three prominent Toronto Blue Jays players who were visibly overweight. Now, some people might not like that language. The reality is that they all looked overweight. Now, baseball has had successful players who have been, have had visibly excess body fat compared to what you would ever expect to see in, let's say, a hockey player, an NBA player, right? And it could be very strongly argued that all three of these players in the Toronto Blue Jays significantly underperformed when they had additional weight on. So in a situation like that, and you have an athlete who is carrying, let's say, excess body fat to the point where we can kind of tell, okay, and that player would benefit from dropping body fat into a range that's normal. Again, how would you get through to that player? Let's say that player actually understands this. Would you, just to clarify something you said earlier, would you prioritize off-season nutrition for that, a conditioning program? Would you go about it by making sure that they're actually fueled better and actually upregulate the cardiovascular conditioning so that way they'll benefit from the cardiovascular conditioning adaptations? Any thoughts there?
I think it's hard for people to understand, because health and sports nutrition, that type of thing, is multifaceted. So when I say to people, they're like, this person's overweight, I'm like, okay, so that's the definition of being overweight, but everything else suggests that they're healthy. Just like you can be quite lean and not healthy. So it's important to understand what their direction is, and why, if someone's telling you just need to lose body fat as a perspective and they feel the need to do that, I'm not saying that we can't say that their goals aren't important, by all means, because everyone's body autonomy and that sort of stuff is personalized into requirements. But it's getting them to understand, if they need to lose a bit of body fat, that's completely fine. We want to make sure we're doing it in a way that's going to be sustainable for them long term, but also working in with the the coach themselves in terms of a strength conditioning coach or exercise physiologist. And it would be best to do it off season because that makes sense. If we're going to manipulate, it's not going to have the risk of their performance. But I guess it's really understanding that, just because they're technically overweight doesn't mean they're not going to perform. If they're performing, that is okay. If there's a risk but then if they're underperforming, is it because of the overweight, or is it because of the fact they're not feeling themselves well at that weight? Like there's heaps of things that you need to consider for a lot of people. And that's why, body power to weight ratio is important, but then to a degree, but then, the sport itself, you got to pay attention to those types of things. Is it when I say, because they're saying they're overweight, is it okay eating outside? Have they got things like a binge eating issues, a psychological aspect as to why they're like that? Those are the things that need to be considered, opposed to just saying to an athlete straight away, look, you need to lose a bit of body fat because it would be beneficial for you. But that's almost a blanket statement. Like you need to go further into that. I'm not saying that they should, that all athletes should be overweight by any means, but I think it's just a stigma that a lot of people just heavily judge an individual. And like I said, you could be overweight and be healthy, but the performance perspective is, if they're noticing it, we've got data as to why it's affecting their performance. And like you said, a cardiovascular perspective and those types of things, then we can potentially look into it. But again, I'm not saying that, back in the day, and this is, haven't admitted this before for a very long time, before I did my degree, I was very much like, well, why? Yes, of course, but then I was so naive to my thinking and hadn't been exposed to any of that. And the critical thinking that there's so much more to it with an athlete. And then mental health is probably the most important thing when it comes to that, because, they're already probably getting slammed for their weight. Like you said, outside of things. So we don't then, as health professionals, want to draw more emphasis towards that. We just want to do it in a way, that's going to be helpful for them. Like, for example, I don't know if they're just eating shit food outside, let's just start with that. So it's a slow and steady step towards those body composition changes in a way that's going to be positive for the athlete, not fueling their likelihood of having eating disorders or disorder eating patterns because of the way that you communicate to them.
Makes
So
perfect
that's a
sense.
very long-winded answer, but there's
No,
always, yeah.
I think it's important nuance. And again, like going down the rabbit hole of baseball players, like obviously I wanted this to relate back to the general population. It's also something that, having watched baseball for a long time, I can say overwhelmingly that there have been a significant number of players who were carrying much extra weight because the nature of the game kind of allows that. But overwhelmingly, there's a massive correlation between the more rapid decline in their careers and injury stuff, whatever, with these cohorts. And so it's like, again, you can cherry pick examples. You can look at hockey. So being Canadian, you think of Alex Ovechkin is kind of known for not necessarily like being the leanest looking guy. And he's about to break Gretzky's record this year at 39 years of age, and he's playing as well as he ever has. But then almost all of the other players who've excelled around the late 30s and played into their 40s are guys like Zdeno Chara or Jaromir Jagr, who are legends for strength and conditioning and just taking very good care of themselves in their off-season regimens as well. So again, I think you handled the nuance really well, right? And again, I think as the fan who's frustrated with outcome, you're right, is that the reason? And I cite the example of the Blue Jays because maybe it had nothing to do with it, but we have this correlation of three players who are visibly, in this condition, and all three massively underperformed their previous play. So you kind of go, all right, is there something going on there, right? And I'm knowledgeable enough to go, I think so. Maybe I'm dead wrong. But anyway, it's also it's a risk of being judgmental about pro athletes too, right?
Yeah.
So you have to check that.
Yeah.
So let's go back to something I was going to go at earlier. Is fueling for elite athletes really fundamentally different from fueling for everyday people?
Yes. So it all comes down to obviously the fact that they're, athletes themselves and their energy expenditure is insane. So like, some of my CrossFit athletes coming into their season training for 6 hours a day. So, the risk of them becoming underfueled is significantly high. So their output and their requirements means that their calories need to increase because, you hear this a lot of stigma on social media with athletes being like, oh, I need to avoid this ingredient. I need to have organic. I need to be fucking whatever it is, clean eating. And I'm like, mate, none of that matters if you're not eating enough. Simply the most important factor for an elite athlete when they need 6,000, 7,000 calories a day is that you're eating enough. So regardless of this shit won't matter if that's not being hit. So getting people to understand, again, even at the elite level, we see this discrepancy of their knowledge deficit about not understanding how much food they actually need. And they're worrying about things that are not necessary. Do you know what I mean? So first and foremost, it's the calorie requirement significantly increased. Then from there, the ratio of the macronutrients will also increase, particularly around carbohydrates. So they're doing a sport, and this comes down to the sport as well, right? So what sport they're doing, but the output associated with CrossFit is high intensity. So, our body's preferred fuel source is carbohydrates. That makes sense. As our energy expenditure increases for demands of the sports, carbohydrates play a critical role, more so because of the fact that they're needing to fuel more. Recreational athletes, and that's why we always say to people, carbohydrates aren't necessary. We know that. However, in saying that, as a sport, as you get more serious in that, your requirements and amounts of that will vary. So recreational athlete just doing it, for everyday shits and gigs, that sort of stuff, won't need as much carbohydrates or calorie requirements compared to the severities of an elite athlete. So as you get more serious in the sport and your professionalism, that will increase as well. But we also see at recreational athlete level, some of the people that I deal with just train for shits and gigs as well. And they train for 2-3 hours a day just because they can. They're not elite, but they will also need to make sure that they're fueling themselves effectively for their goals that they're trying to perform. So everyone's goal is important. It's just the severity of it will change depending on their outcome that they're chasing, I guess.
What about people who have a strong belief against consuming, let's say, high calorie, high sugar, like things with high fructose corn syrup? An example, the cyclists that I know and have worked with, there's sort of a thing in the cycling world about drinking Coke, right? That's a thing, right?
Yeah.
So ultimately, I mean, I could preface this with, obviously, if someone's consuming like Michael Phelps training for the Olympics level of energy output, you can't get that in steak, potatoes, and asparagus. You just can't do that, right? So any thoughts, comments on the kinds of fuels that are okay? And to the person who would be afraid of consuming, whether it's sports drinks or Coca-Cola or other just like high sugar foods.
Yeah. It's getting people to, I guess, the nuance within this area, isn't it? Is that, majority of the time with athletes, we still want to make sure it's that 80-20 approach. That the shitty foods that you see people consuming, such as the ones you just suggested, are bridging that gap. So people need to understand that it's not their whole diet. It's just, like you said, if you need to eat 700 grams of carbohydrates, you ain't going to get that from rice, broccoli, and sweet potato. So, majority of the diet still needs to be good quality foods. But again, those foods of those highly processed are coming in for a reason. Those ultra processed foods are there, to make sure they're hitting their energy requirements. Because at the end of the day, if they don't meet their energy requirements, it doesn't matter what they're eating, they're going to be at the risk of underfueling. And that means that longevity in the sport will be significantly decreased as an athlete because they're not meeting their requirements to begin with. Usually those types of foods are also positioned in around their training. So it's tactic and I guess protocols to why they're being utilized. And also, like you said, it's simply, if you're giving someone 120 grams of cereal from Fruit Loops or Cocoa Pops after their training session, that's a hell of a lot easier to meet their carb requirements than sitting there and trying to eat 500 grams of sweet potato plus the appetite suppression that we see after training. So there's a lot of, I guess, people don't understand the critical thinking and the application for sports nutrition as to why it's being applied in the first place. They just see straight away, this person is telling this athlete to have Cocoa Pops. I can't believe they're doing that. Like, why would they be doing that? So I guess, again, it comes down to that application for the individual themselves. And that, again, these guys are only elite for a short period of time. So it's not like the majority of their life is eating those shit foods. It is for a period of time that they're utilizing it for their sporting career, which we know for most athletes is what, max 15 years, 20 years, depending on their sport. So in the grand scheme of things, those, it sounds ironic, and a lot of people will probably I can't believe she's saying that, but those ultra processed foods are healthy given the individual context. So it's not healthy for you probably, myself, to be having those foods every single day at the amounts that I train, and I train quite a lot, but healthy looks different to the individual that we're talking about. And that's very important.
Love it. The lifespan of an athletic career is interesting and relevant. So again, having grown up, played, and watched a lot of professional sports, there are stories of a lot of retired football players, NBA players, sometimes other sports, who they still eat the way that they did during their playing careers. And that has led to weight gain because they're no longer training anywhere near the same level. Any added thoughts there?
Yeah, I think that's a reflection of the athlete, but also whoever they've worked with. Like, that's an allied health professional's lack of education towards the individual. So like, obviously there've been a lot of emphasis, or maybe not even education, but saying these are the foods that you need to have as you retire, or, you know, out of the sport. There's no education of that transition into what it's like to be back to a normal gen pop individual. And that in itself is going to have massive concerns, because they're still eating at the energy expenditure that they thought they were, without the education or, you know, knowledge deficit as to why that's a problem now. And then it has increased associated risks of, you know, a lot of issues because of the fact that they're eating those ultra processed foods when they're not needed. So again, that's a bit of a, you know, what came first, you know, chicken or the egg in that instance, because it's up to the individual themselves, but also why wasn't that educated after their season or their professional career? Because we see that with heaps of athletes, not just, you know, on all scenarios, like swimmers particularly, also a good example. And that really does need to be provided, because that's a psychological concern as well. So not only are they dealing with the fact that they're retired athletes, now they have to go back into normality. That affects all areas of their life. And 9 times out of 10, a lot of athletes can't really accept that. So then they turn towards food as a comfort as well. So we see that psychological aspect coming in too. So again, it's a very never black and white answer with that. But we do see that quite regularly. And I look at that 9 times out of 10, I'm like, that's a knowledge deficit. And that's also on the athlete, but also the team that they're working with. That should be better exit strategy.
I love the nuance you're adding and challenging ways I presented questions. So this is fantastic. So I brought you on, right? So I'll shout you out again later as where people can find you, but I actually hope people will dive into your media for this level of nuance, as opposed to a lot of the walking through grocery store aisles, filming and demonizing food shit that we are so frustrated by. Let's go back to, because kind of going back and forth a little bit, but I did want to get a little bit more on the keto stuff, the low carb stuff, intermittent fasting, carnivore, because we also know these things are popular. And so let's say you've got someone who is eating with these approaches, these ideologies, and they're kind of rooted within. We could also say veganism as well. Veganism probably has a different moral, you know, aspect to it. Although some people, I think, also choose it as an ideology and choose it, you know, they all have purported health benefits. Some far more dubious carnivore than others. But if you got someone who's just determined to do keto or determined to do intermittent fasting, and maybe they're underfueling on in general or certainly carbohydrates, is there anything that you would suggest that they do to try to at least buffer the negative risks if they are also a recreational or, God forbid, a high level athlete?
Yeah. Look, I am pretty blunt with this. If we don't, like, I guess, can see eye to eye, then I just don't work with them, because I'm like, this is going to be an ongoing concern. Like my goal as a health professional is to make sure that you are meeting, you know, areas that are going to benefit your life. And if we can't just seem to work together, then it's not going to happen. I'm very against, you know, low carb, keto, carnivore, regardless. There is scenarios, for example, where keto can be beneficial, as we know, in terms of epileptic individuals. But, you know, 9 times out of 10, I say to people, like, what's your reason as to why you're doing this diet? What is your understanding of the diet? That's usually what I start with, and not in a judgmental way by any means, trying to get where their you know, discrepancies with their knowledge. And then just getting them to understand, like, you know, regardless of the, you know, the diet that you've chosen, the benefits for the sport that you're doing, whether you're recreational or elite, it's just not going to work. Like, it's understanding those systems. And, you know, there's some people I've worked with who have been like intermittent fasting, and they've done, I guess, low carb, not keto. And I said, look, if you're going to be doing this, it makes sense for positioning your carbs in and around your training, especially the type of training that you are doing. So let's start with that and see the benefits that we make. So there have been some individuals that I have worked with. I don't work with any carnivore. I just, it's against my morals. You know, like, in terms of evidence base as well, I just can't. That sounds really horrible, but, like, being honest, you know, so, but yes.
I think there's going to be a self-selection bias. I mean, nothing about your media screams carnivore diet people come and, you know, could do this. I mean, I'm actually not aware of, anecdotally, even any stories where you get like high level athletes who are doing things like carnivore. I think that's a totally different basket. Okay, there's a bunch of stuff you said in here. So what about the need for intra-workout carbs? You know, let's say the average everyday person, they're lifting for an hour, maybe there's 30 minutes of cardio on top of that. Does this person need sports drinks? Does this person need gummy worms, candy, Do they need electrolyte drinks?
No. So it comes down again to your goal, how long you're doing it for. And when you even say, but someone might say, I'm doing it for 75 minutes. I'm like, yes, but you're doing a warm up. You're not really going hard for the entire 75 minutes, right? So, coming into that session with a pre-training nutrition about, we like say 0.5 to 1 gram to kilogram of body weight as your pre-workout 30, 45 minutes prior will be suffice for that workout, depending on your intensity that you're bringing to that. Okay. We start to recommend intra-workouts when the individual has, more intense training blocks or goal-driven. So, for example, intermediate to elite CrossFit athletes is when we start to utilize that because they are training over 2 to 3 hours. But apart from that, you don't need that. Your body will be able to fuel adequately with what you've been provided with it as well. If people get this, I guess, misconception with intra drinks and sports drinks and hydration strategies and gummies and lollies and those types of things, and they're not relevant. Again, context is key to the individual, and whether that's necessary for what they're trying to do in terms of their output.
I did a course a long time ago in performance nutrition, and one thing stood out to me. There's a certain, and you would know infinitely more about this than I remember because I haven't had a lot of athletes that this is relevant, but especially for endurance athletes, there's a rate at which you could absorb glucose and fructose, and beyond which you go, and then you could actually have GI distress, which is why you'll sometimes see marathon runners literally shit themselves. So can you provide any guidance around that or explanation? And especially with the ratio, if for anyone who engages in this stuff and if I'm not mistaken, the ratio matters because glucose and fructose are metabolized in a slightly different pathway, which means we could actually get more fuel for ultra endurance athletes if we actually have a balance of the two versus trying to go straight glucose. Please explain that for us.
100%. So it comes down to metabolism of those carbohydrate sources. So for example, with carbohydrates that are glucose, we can only absorb 1 gram per minute, means that we maximize at 60 grams per hour. And after that, that's when we start to see gastrointestinal distress. With fructose, it's only about 0.5, so half of that. So it means that, for an hour of glucose exercise, we see 60 grams for that hour, and for fructose, it's around about 30 grams. Now, if you exceed those, that's when you start to see gastrointestinal distress, particularly with fructose, because like you said, it takes longer to digest different pathways, and, it's not as readily available. So what we do from sports nutrition perspective, this is what you see a great example is Tour de France and different combinations of those athletes, is when we combine the two plus with other different carbohydrates too. We have multiple transport carbohydrates. So pretty much they have a buddy, they're partnered together. And now, for example, you can go up to 90 grams per hour for an individual and higher, depending on their training requirements. And that also comes down to training the gut as well, because the gut is very adaptable. But with athletes from this perspective, we need to make sure they can sit well and their body can, absorb it effectively. Because like I said, gastrointestinal stress is huge, particularly with endurance, because it's a lot of mechanical stress and it's very stressful on the gut. If you think about what they're doing the entire time frame, depending if it's triathlon, marathons, Tour de France, the positioning of their body the entire time is also very important to pay attention to. So I guess it's getting people to understand. That's like, when we see a lot of people who use whole foods, there's not anything necessarily wrong with just using fructose, but you're using fructose in isolation and you're doing very long runs or endurance sports, that's going to become a problem. So, it's getting them to understand sports nutrition can be a requirement, because you think about those individuals, if we can only absorb a certain amount of fructose and they need a high amount per hour when they're running or riding or that type of thing, that becomes a problem as well. So it's getting people to understand the combination. And the biggest thing I can say to people is what it does to your gut. It's very important. Just because there's something in science and this is a theory, then practicality, what works for someone is totally different. Those guidelines are very broad when you then make it more specific to the individual.
Is there any variance between people of different body weights, body sizes, and across men and women?
I think, again, it's going to be individualized regardless. Okay. So it depends on the exposure of carbohydrates. It's not a big thing. So if an athlete has low carb naturally, and then they're trying to have a lot of carbohydrates in around their training, their body just naturally isn't used to digesting, metabolizing that as much. So that's a big concern that we see first and foremost, because they just need to naturally have a high amount of carbohydrates. It doesn't even matter about pre or intra-workout if they haven't even got carbohydrates present in their diet regularly to begin with. So that's a concern. But in general, I think it's just making sure that the individual themselves can tolerate it, because it comes down to individual preferences. And that's really important to consider, I guess.
Are there any other nutritional timing strategies that you'd recommend for, let's say, a recreational athlete? Again, the person who lifts for an hour, maybe it's an hour and a half workout lifting and cardio, the person who's playing recreational hockey, recreational rugby, etc.
I think the biggest, like a lot of people would say, oh, you need to make sure that the pre-trained nutrition sorted. For me, I'm like, it's not even that. It's making sure you're hitting your nutrition foundations. So your principles of your daily nutrition. That's so important, because if they're not meeting the 99% of their dietary requirements just for a general day to day, it doesn't matter about their pre-workout. You can have the most amazing pre-workout nutrition, post-workout nutrition, but none of that's going to matter if your daily nutrition isn't being met. So first and foremost, that's most important. You know, the whole 2 serves of fruit, 5 serves of vegetables, carbohydrates, protein, like just the general principles, right? From there, you know, depending on their requirements, it's about, okay, so it's going to be somewhat beneficial to have a pre-workout nutrition, depending on the intensity. It's going to help you. The types that we choose, like, for example, people are like, oh, well, she said I could have lollies. I'm meeting all my requirements within reason, but I'm like, you're not having your 2 serves of fruit. So don't have lollies or anything that's ultra processed. Meet your requirements first, and then we can adapt for the individual. Because it's not that their goals aren't important. Don't get me wrong, they definitely are. But the severity of what they're trying to achieve is very low. So again, we just make sure their general health is being met. And then as they get more, you know, into their sports, that's when we become a little bit more titrated with what we do.
What about things like, you know, protein timing, fiber, the things that digest slower around workouts? Is there anything that you're concerned here? Or is this really majoring in the minor for you?
Yeah, a little bit of both. So for example, as your energy requirements become more, I guess, severe with athletes, when you're doing double day training and that type of thing, your recovery window is smaller between sessions. That's when we really pay attention to it. But 9 times out of 10 with athletes, it's always about, or even recreational, everyday individuals, is making sure you're hitting your total protein requirement. That's first and foremost most important. And for the day. And then from there, you know, if you're training, let's just say 5 p.m. in the afternoon, you want to make sure that roughly 2 hours prior, you're having a good combination of like carbohydrates and protein, because we know that's a mixed module meal, which means it's going to take a while for it to break down. So by the time you finish that training session, if you've had a pre-workout, you know, 30 minutes prior, you're going to have some amino acids happening, right? So then the nuance from there is that people are like, I need to have a protein shake straight away. I was like, but do you? Your training session is not for another 24 hours. So, you know, we know with training that it takes up to 24 to 48 hours for all that to occur in terms of recovery. So it then becomes, no, again, just focusing on hitting your total protein. Those types of things is more important than those specific strategies when it doesn't apply to the individual context again.
So the anabolic window, which we effectively know is a debunked concept, but that's totally overrated issue, right? Like, want to explain it a bit better than that?
Yeah, I guess a lot of people again come down to they're not understanding. They're just reading something and then they're taking their own personal advice. But okay, I definitely need to be having that protein shake post training. Like I said, comes down to individual context. The key, and context is key, is necessary. So at the end of the day, making sure that, you know, if you finish training, you're going to be going home probably and having a main meal anyway, that's going to be having a mix of carbs, fats, proteins, micronutrients. So you got to be hitting that quota anyway. It becomes, like I said, it becomes more of a concern when you're doing double day training. You know, you have 2 hours between your training sessions. You need to be focusing on protein for recovery, making sure you're getting some carbohydrates before you go back to the next training session. You're under fueled, you have a loss of appetite. See, those types of things start to then become more of a concern with how we're going to fuel that individual to maintain adequate fueling, essentially.
What about alcohol in all this? I know there's all this attention now about how no amount of alcohol is good. You know, there's a lot of signaling about that. And then, you know, we don't need, there's no point in us going into the social dynamics of it in modern drinking, but just alcohol in general as something that is in people's lives and its effects on their performance for recreational activity.
Yeah. Look, at the end of the day, you know, it comes down to what the individual is doing, the frequency that they're doing, and how much they're willing to change, right? So stage of change is very important. Again, it's getting, I know you said we all know the benefits of it, but allowing the individual to understand it based on the consumption that they currently have. Like if they're doing quite a lot, you know, then we need to sit down and be like, okay, just by eliminating just your alcohol to, instead of let's just say it's 4 drinks they're having, like, you know what, if we go down to 3, that's going to have a benefit. We've got to choose whatever we're trying to intervene with. We need to make sure it's realistic for the individual. Of course, we'd love everyone not to drink alcohol, right? But the benefits associated with that for some people is it's a stress coping strategy. So just cutting it out like that is like not going to be beneficial for the individual. So reducing it as much as we can is always going to be amazing for the individual, regardless of their recreational to elite. But you also got to understand what comes with that alcohol consumption. That is very important. So a lot of people just say, it's cut this out, cut that out. It's like, all right, that'd be great, Sharon and Karen, to do that. But is it going to be realistic for the individual at hand, and really assessing their environment as well as their psychological impacts as to why they're choosing that as a coping mechanism, or why it's just in their diet on a day-to-day basis. It's so important.
Is there anything, specific about, like, let's say someone has a few drinks the day before they go and they play hockey? I mean, how detrimental is this? And, what about the beer league stuff where they go, and they go have a few with the boys or the girls after sports?
So first with that is, like, prior to any type of game, regardless of whether you're recreational or to elite, I just say it's not a habit that you want to get into by any means. And it's not going to be beneficial for your performance, regardless of what that level is, and when they say post game, the biggest thing that we're going to focus on with the individual is, make sure you have some hydration in, a good quality meal post training. You're meeting those foundational requirements for a good quality food, and having, 1 to 2 here and there is completely fine, but it's not a habit that you want to get into. I know it's hard because a lot of, especially in the, the men background, they always do that to celebrate games. But it's, again, if you're hitting those requirements of those non-negotiables, hydration is sort of post training, that's or post game, here and there is fine, but again, not habit that I'd like people to get into.
So if you just won the city championships, go nuts, but everything else, it's like, I think you've handled it with great nuance. All right, what about any supplementation guidelines? Let's see, again, you've got the recreational athlete. Is there anything that you try to say, hey, it might be worth looking at this, supplementation strategies, or are there things that people are readily jumping towards you and you're thinking, hey, you don't need this?
I think the biggest thing with anything is always to assess the individual's dietary intake first and foremost, and seeing what they're obviously lacking in, because as we know, supplementation is to supplement the diet. And yes, a lot of people are taking unnecessary supplementation that they don't necessarily need, particularly like you'll hear people take, I take vitamins and micronutrients, but their diet's quite poor. And again, that comes down to, again, there's a behavior instinct here. We need to make sure that your general intake is better. We're all adults. We all need to eat our vegetables, those types of things as well. There are circumstances where they can play their part. But I always say to people, once we check that, majority of the time people don't have amazing, fish oil or omega-3s in their diet. So it may be beneficial for the individual to have omega-3s in terms of fish oils. Creatine is obviously a big one. We all know we don't need to go into the pros and cons of that. Pros of that in terms of, I personally feel like one should be taking it, particularly in strength and conditioning based sport. And then there's things that can be utilized that we can have to people, depending on where they live and location, like vitamin D, is that necessary as well, depending on the individual themselves. Caffeine can be something, where you live in Australia, well, definitely not. And then, within reason, because, the tanner your skin is, that's not ideal either in terms of vitamin D absorption. And then you're looking at things like, okay, can caffeine be utilized for the individual? Because, it's beneficial to support perception of effort. Protein powders can be utilized, again, to fortify or to help with meeting those requirements if necessary. Beta-alanine, again, as within strength and conditioning, probably don't need to touch on that, but it's beneficial. And it all comes down to, I guess, the person's goal. So if you want to become more, successful in your sport and do well, then supplementation is going to help with that 1%. Do you know what I mean? Providing that 99% of your requirements have been met. So yes, I think it's a pro and con. It comes down to the individual if it's necessary, and then from there we suggest.
Wonderful. If for anybody who's more interested in this topic, if you scroll back several episodes, Dr. Alan Bacon came on and we went full into lots on creatine. I think beta-alanine was in there, betaine was in there. Alan does a really great job of this stuff with his media. So check out that episode if you're really interested. Okay, one last thing I'm curious about, because this one's fun, is how do you approach fueling for clients, athletes when recovering from an injury? And do you caution people against trying to focus on fat loss while they're recovering from an injury? And how do you approach adjusting nutrition to accommodate the lower training intensity? What's the balance there?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people struggle with this because they automatically think straight away that they need to cut their calories quite dramatically. And we know with the recovery process that you need additional calories. So obviously being on a lower calories can slow down the healing process. So there's a bit of pro and con. You want to be at least at maintenance to support that healing process as well. And also too, you want to make sure, so first of all, is calories, so you don't cut them too dramatically. You put it at least at maintenance, because obviously your expenditure will go down. So naturally that does need to decrease because you're obviously not meeting the same requirements that you were doing pre-injury. Then from there is fueling this rehab process. So a lot of people don't actually pay attention to making sure that you still need to make sure your body's having the ability of having calories to support that healing process. So carbohydrates will be important, but also so will protein. So the recommendation, obviously, because the increased risk of muscle mass with injury is high. For general intake in terms of your injury process is around that 1.6 to 2.5 grams per kilogram per day of protein. And obviously too, like we spoke about with, I'm sure you guys did mention that in your previous episodes as well, is that creatine helps with building strength and muscle. So obviously it has, obvious pros for longer rehab areas as well. Omega-3s are going to be beneficial for that due to the, I guess, enhanced anabolic sensitivity potentially with that as well, around that 2 to 4 grams of fish oil per day. And then, you could go into the argument, depending on what the injury is. There is some promising evidence with collagen and vitamin C combination with that as well. So our tendons and ligaments, depending on the injury, right? But our tendons, ligaments, and cartilage all contain collagen as their main protein. So the theory behind it is that collagen supplementation could help with those injuries involved in those areas, but it also needs to be coupled with vitamin C, because we know that collagen protein powder by itself is a pretty useless protein, but utilizing it with vitamin C helps with the absorption. And usually that timing is around that 40 to 60 minutes before exercise, which is when those amino acids of collagen pretty much peak within the blood. So, a collagen supplementation cannot really target injured areas naturally, but the best we can do is attempt it by providing those irrelevant amino acids to benefit during those rehab processes beneficial for that injury, if that makes sense. And then from that, I think it's just very important from the psychological aspect as well. Like I keep touching back on this, but from an injury perspective, it's very important as an allied health professional, if you're identifying this with your clientele, to refer onwards, whether it's a psychologist, that type of thing, to get them to understand that, because that can be a very hard process to go through. I went through a pretty severe injury, and I used to be a competitive athlete in weightlifting. I am not made for weightlifting. If you saw me in person, I'm a slow twitch muscle fiber athlete. But, I used to compete in Ollie lifting. So, snatch and clean and jerk. And I had a full rupture of my Achilles. So surgery. And that is probably like up there with one of the worst injuries you can have as an athlete. And that rehab and psychological distress, because you've gone from being able to train double day training to absolutely nothing. So I can say firsthand, being and seeing a sports psychologist during that time frame pretty much changed my life, as well as obviously working with other allied health professionals too. So it's a very big area that I don't think a lot of allied health touch on, is the importance of mental health and mindset as an athlete, both in season, off season, injury, whatever it may be.
This is definitely beyond the scope of this conversation, but you for
Yeah.
sure, you get retired athletes, injured athletes. I mean, if their sport, their status as an athlete is a core part of their identity, and then that is temporarily or permanently suspended, then that could potentially be very challenging on their emotional well-being. You've experienced that yourself. So I think that's really smart. Everybody can find you at _sports dietitian. Now, I notice that it's spelled, it's spelled,
Yeah.
so I guess it's spelled differently in Australia. So it's DIETITIAN. There's no C in there, right?
Yeah. No, it's a common thing that we get, hence why I'm laughing before you even said it.
Yeah, because people will be like, I can't find her, right? Or just, I think when you search Taylor Ryan, it shows up as well. So are there any other
thank you.
resources you would like to direct people to?
No, I think that's completely fine. That's the easiest way. That's where I put most of my information, generally debunking and general sports nutrition for every individual. So yes, that's great. Thank you.
Wonderful. And again, for everybody listening, I just coming back from a little bit of travel. And so I may mention this in future episodes, but somehow in the travel, maybe it was the air pressure change of the flights or what have you, but I've had a reoccurrence of some brain fog and vertigo that I've had to deal with in the past few years. So I don't have a clear answer on it. Seem to be functioning just fine today, but you may notice this with me. It affects clarity of focus. It can affect sometimes just literally stringing together thoughts and sentences. So thankfully, Taylor is just dives right in and is very articulate. Meanwhile, the episodes have been doing incredibly well. It seems like people have been sharing them with friends, people in their world. So I'm hoping you guys will keep doing that. If you listen to this, you've got an athlete in your world, you're thinking, all right, they would love this. They would love Taylor's media. Please put this in their hands. Send it right in a DM, share it on your social media, and you could always message me as well. Tag me up with this stuff. But if you have any questions, please message me directly. Please go follow Taylor. And thank you for continuously listening, sharing, supporting. Thank you, Taylor.
Thanks, Legend. Appreciate it.